Let's take a look at what we call target management inside Harness feature flags today. And notice we call it target management. We don't call it users or accounts or things like that, and we'll talk about why that is. So if I take a look at the Harness feature flag UI, you'll see there is a list of flags here, and on the left sidebar we've got target management. So if we jump over here, you'll see there's nothing here. Now, targets in Harness are environment specific. So up here, I could change environments. Right now, we're in production. And the reason for that is because targets, or the other option at the top, target groups you see, these are how we decide which flags are going to be turned on or off for which folks or for which cohorts of people. And so in production, that might be your end users, end accounts, some cohort of your production traffic. Whereas in dev, QA, it might just be yourself or your internal engineering team or a test audience of those kinds of folks. So your targets are going to be different per environment. Now, if we take a look at what's actually happening here, I'll go ahead and pop open some code. All you do in Harness is you install the SDK like we see here. We initialize it with an SDK key, which we'll take a look at, and you define a target. So a target's always going to have an ID, it's always going to have a name, and it's going to have a collection of attributes optionally. And you'll see attributes are just going to be any other piece of data or metadata that I want to pass along about the target, like location, version, it could be plan type or country, sign up date, anything along those lines that you might want to work with. And we'll look at some scenarios of how you work with it. Taking a look here, you'll see my identifier is just a UID. My name is username2. And then I've got a location and maybe the version my application is running on here. Now, you'll see I'm hard coding these values. Most of the time, you're not going to do that, right? You're going to use a variable or something like that from your account system or from your application to inject these values dynamically per session. So let's go ahead and do this. I'll save this. I've got a running version of this page over here. I will refresh it, and then I'll jump back. When I refresh Harness, I'm actually going to see the target here in my UI. There we go. And you'll see the data here matches exactly what we put in the system. And if I wanted, I could jump over here. I could turn a flag on or off for this specific target or choose the specific state. So maybe I want to serve one of these states for this specific end user. And I could do the same thing over here from the flag page as well, where I could say serve this state of the flag to this individual target. Now, what's worth noting here is I set the target ID to a user ID. And so what's going to happen is as folks use your application, the SDK is going to authenticate, it's going to reach upstream to Harness, and it's going to say, what target am I? Who do I identify with so I know what flag configuration to load? If that target exists, then we'll go ahead and start matching the flag configuration to the target. If it doesn't exist, we will create the target on Harness from the data in the SDK. And that's why even though you do see a new target button here, you can upload CSVs of target lists, you can create targets programmatically via the API. Sometimes that's useful, like if you need to preload some data or a configuration in advance of going to production with a new system. Most of the time, though, you're going to want to let Harness create the targets for you as people use your applications so that as you create flag rules, it's all against validated data in your system. Right? You don't want to make a flag rule against some targets you sideloaded, but then the data you sideloaded is slightly different than the data that shows up here in the application, and then your flag rules don't work. So what you want to do is define your sort of target object or the target schema, and then let people actually using the application, like we just saw, stamp out a bunch of targets. Now, as that process happens, this identifier is key for determining what's going on inside of a target. And here's what I mean. If I set this to a UID, I'm going to create targets for every single end user of my application. If I have hundreds, thousands, millions, that's how many targets I'm going to end up with. Now, if I'm doing that, let's say I'm an e-commerce company, I might have hundreds of thousands of targets in the system. That's usually not going to be an effective way to test out my flags, right? I'm not going to want to go choose one by one by one from a list of hundreds of thousands. So that's where target groups come in. Now, if we look at target groups, you'll see there's a couple in the system. There's two ways you can build them. One way you can build them is by choosing individual targets. So I could say these lists of targets are my VIP accounts, or they're my beta testers, or they're our own employees, so we want to test with them first. But the other way you can do it is going back to, if you remember from our code, these attributes. I can use those to build rules here. So I can say if location, which again is one of the ones we are passing right over here, if location is EU, then this target group would match any users who fulfill that. So there could be 100,000 users, doesn't matter how many you have in the system, you only have to target flags against the one group to target all of them by matching that attribute rule. And you can add a flag to the group exactly like what we just saw with the target. So groups are ultimately going to be supersets or larger cohorts of your individual targets. But what hierarchy a target actually is completely up to you. Here's what I mean. This is a UID, so I'm creating them for every end user. What if instead I did something like this? I could say account ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I could say this is big account, right? We'll save this. Now, this is a little different, right? Because maybe we've got 500 people, but they all have the same account ID. They have different UIDs, but I'm not passing the UID anymore. I'm passing the account ID, which everybody on the same account is going to share. Think of like somebody selling software in a business-to-business context, right? You may have hundreds of customers. Each customer may have thousands of users, but you only have a few hundred of these unique account IDs. So when I save this, I'm going to go back here. We'll run this page, pop back over here, and then what we see is now we have a target in the system for that account. And so now this individual target could be representing hundreds of users if they all share that account ID. So maybe you don't want hundreds of thousands of targets of your end users, because maybe you don't ever want to turn things on or off for just one individual person. Maybe you only want to do them at the account level, and you only want to have hundreds or a couple thousand targets, and you just want to say turn it on for everyone at big account, and if that's 500 employees, they're all going to get the same flag. It's the exact same way of turning the flag on, though. And that is exactly why we don't say user or account, because targets are a hierarchy level you set. Now, target groups are still always going to work the same way, right? They're going to be a superset or a cohort where you're either adding them explicitly or doing individual rules to match the attributes. But if you want individual user targets or account level targets, or we even have folks that do something like this, server ID 1, and they'll say this is, tenant 1. They could do something like that, save it, and they're not even using targets to represent people. They're using targets to represent, instead, servers or tenants. That's totally fine, right? You can absolutely do that. Or if we want to backpedal a bit, let's do this. We'll go back, undo some of our changes, go back to the original. So this is where we started, right? If I wanted, what if instead of location, I wanted to provide tenant? Now, I could provide both. I'm just changing it, but you'll see here, and let's go ahead and do this for a new target. So we'll do UID 2234. This is going to be user 3. I've added this tenant attribute. So one way I could do tenant is I could do the identifier as the tenant, right? We just saw that. If we jump back over here, refresh our page a couple times, go ahead and let the target get created, jump back over here. Now when we see this new user in our system, there we go here, he's got this tenant in the system. So now I could actually take tenant, I could go over to my target group, I could build a target group of, let's say, tenants. I could say now, if tenant equals tenant 1, I could turn on for every user that's on tenant 1, or every account is on tenant 1. So there's really two ways to do it. You can either make the target a server, an account, a user, however you want to do it, or you could make the target an end user, an account, and then for these other dimensions you might want to target by, add them as attributes in the system. So one of the exercises we always encourage folks to think through is, what is the lowest level of targeting you're ever going to want to do? If even one time a year you're going to want to turn flags on for an individual user, you probably want to make targets as users. And then most of the time, maybe you're actually doing things with groups because you're not turning them on or off for users that often. And then you want to think, what attribute data do I want to send so I can build all the different cohorts that I can? Or if you're, again, sort of a B2B company, maybe you just don't want to turn things on for some users and not others, and there your targets are going to be accounts, like we discussed earlier. Now, the last thing I want to highlight is kind of how this whole thing works from an authentication standpoint. So inside your environments, you generate unique SDK keys. So you're going to inject those into your code per environment. So you're going to have that key get injected as the prod key, the dev key, the QA key, that kind of thing. And that's how we know what flag configuration to pull for which environment, as well as which environment to create any individual target in. And that's how target management works in Harness feature flags.